Hey guys, and welcome back to iPod Microphone. Glad to see you return to us. To all my regular listeners, I'm happy you keep stopping by to listen to me talk about random ass nerdy shit and just whatever I happen to be into at the moment. And Autumn, I hope you're still listening. I saw your message about a shout out way too late. Um, but shout out to you. Hope you keep coming back. I get into the third of my trilogy on role playing games today. I will get into that here in a moment. I just want to mention that I've been watching Shameless. It's streaming on Netflix right now. And honestly, I didn't know anything about the series before I started watching it, except that everyone review wise was interested in it, so I figured I would check it out, and it's pretty fucking good so far, except for the Steve Billy character. If you're familiar with the show, I could fucking do without that guy, but whatever. We move on from there. Everything else is super super good. I like it. So check it out if you haven't. I recommend it. But anyway, let's get into what we all came here for. The meat and potatoes, as it were, of this whole thing. The crux of the matter. One thing I didn't really touch on very strongly, and one thing that I think is kind of important to understand, at least from a basic standpoint, is how a role playing game works. A lot of people don't necessarily get the concept. Like it's not just like, so it's playing pretend. Like I used to do that as a kid. We all did. You know? Oh, and now we're in a house, and now it's a castle, and there's a princess, and we're all, like we all used to play pretend. But what a role playing game does is it gives structure to a world. It creates what someone might describe as physics. It describes rules and boundaries and limits to things that you can and can't do, which is just like real life, but then adds on top of that a layer of unreality where you can step into a role and do something that in the real world you wouldn't be able to do. But part of the fun, which is something that a lot of people don't quite get, is that you start from a fundamental basis. That we can't just do whatever we say, like you could in the playground. Oh, I shoot you with my gun. Oh, I have a force field that deflects all bullets. Oh, I shoot you with a laser which goes through your bullet deflecting force field. No, actually, I have a mirrored suit on which deflects all lasers. Like, so you can't just do shit like that, which is frustrating. So you start with a structure, you start with a foundation of what we can all do and what we can all not do based on our stats, our attributes, the number of dice that we get to roll for a particular action. And then from there, we layer on top of it the fantasy persona that we want to embody, to become for a brief spell of hours. Oh, I want to be a barbarian and I want to wade through my enemies and soak my sword in their blood. Oh, I'm a swashbuckler. I want to cut the rope and swing from one side of the room to the other, laughing all the way. Oh, I'm a sadistic motherfucker and I want to sneak behind people and slit their throats in the dark. For all the talk of in the 80s about them being evil, I mean, it can be an outlet for your darkest fantasies. It can be a way to express those parts of yourselves which may not necessarily be, PC or socially acceptable, but something you might want to explore. Like what it's like to murder somebody. Now, I'm not saying that we should go out and murder people, but I'm saying that we're all curious what that might be like. And if it happened, how we might react to that. Now, I've never roleplayed as myself in a scenario where I stab somebody. But I have roleplayed as other characters that have stabbed and or shot or killed people. And I always think about that, how the character would feel about what I just did. And that in turn makes me think about how myself as a person might react to that. And I don't see a downside to that. I mean, we've got to explore the darker sides of our personalities sometimes. We can't neglect them. We can't allow them to fester, or someday they explode. A postman, shoots a post office up and kills a bunch of people. Or, several people go to schools and shoot school children for some reason. Or a guy opens up on a Batman movie theater. Like, we need outlets for our darkness. We need to be able to accept that it's a part of ourselves, or we can't move past it. It becomes something that we're terrified of, and something that consumes us, and eventually hurts other people. This is part of how I feel about role-playing games. This isn't necessarily where I intended to go with this conversation, but this is what came out of me. And this is, I think, important. There were times in my life where I have been less than pleased with myself, less than even terrified with some of the things that entered my head. And being able to enter an arena, being able to go into a system that was like life, bound by rules and had consequences for actions, and I could experiment with maybe the nastier choices that a person might make and how that might make me feel. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it taught me a lot about myself, taught me a lot about how I interact with other people and the world. I mean, if anything, it helped me realize that I wasn't necessarily crazy. I had crazy thoughts, which we all do from time to time. And it, helped me have a release for those thoughts. Maybe some days I'm going to be a little crazier than I am other times. It's fine. It taught me that it was fine. And that there were ways to get that out, healthy ways to get that out, that didn't, affect anyone else permanently. Just in this fantasy world that didn't exist. And that's where I started, where it all began. I wanted to talk about systems. Now, I don't know if this is going to last. All right, I'm going to make this as brief as possible so as not to bore the shit out of you any more than I need to. How these games work is I have a stat or an attribute. Some common ones are like strength and dexterity, which is either your raw muscle power or your agility, your flexibility, your mobility, for example. There's also intelligence, how smart you are, charisma, your likability, and also your physical appearance. Some play systems use wisdom, which is intelligence can be seen as book smarts, wisdom can be seen as street smarts. Some people differentiate between agility and reaction, possibility. That's Shadowrun, where we break dexterity down into two different facets, whereas in a lot of games like the one I'm going to talk about tonight and D&D Pathfinder, it's just one stat. Your dexterity combines all of that. One could say that your ability to react to something and your ability to avoid it would be separate abilities, so I can see that. But essentially, whatever that physical or mental characteristic is given an associated value. A number value. Doesn't matter specifically what that number is. It's all abstract. Alright? And then you have also usually skills. Things that are not inherent to your physical characteristics. Things that you haven't necessarily been born with or, worked towards. But things that you've actually strived to learn. So, for example, I may be born really strong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I can hit someone with a sword when I swing it. I have to know how to swing the sword, and I have to know how to swing it so that the person that I'm swinging it at actually gets hit by it. I mean, yes, eventually if you swing a sword at somebody, you're going to hit them. But if you want to do it effectively, we have to learn how. And I may be born with the mental capacity to work a computer and to hack a computer, but if I don't have any training in hacking or working on computers, one could say that it's impossible for me to hack a computer. So basically there's two ways that this can break down. There's the D&D Pathfinder system, where everything is assigned a bonus. Based on your stat level, you will be given a certain ability bonus that you can add to your skills. And everything is assigned one die, and that is the D20. It's a 20-sided die. You roll that. You will roll, if you're attacking, you roll any relevant attack modifiers based on your strength and your class, and that determines whether or not you hit something. If you're doing a skill, you roll a d20 and then you add your skill modifier, however many points you put in that skill, plus any bonus that you get from its relevant attribute. And that's basically how that works. Now, D&D also uses other dice, usually for damage. Various weapons do various die of damage. The weakest weapons will do a d4, or a d3, which is half of a d6, but we'll talk about that later. Or the more powerful weapons will do a d12, or 2 d6s, or 2 d8s, so on and so forth. Depending on the weapon's class and if it has any magical bonuses, it may add to your skill check or to your damage total. But that's basically how it works. There's one die to determine the effects, whether or not something happens, and then there's another die to determine the result, how effective that damage is. They also use what are called percentile dice, which are d10s. You've got one d10, which is your 1s. You've got another d10, which is your 10s, and you roll that. And that can equal up to 100%. And you use that occasionally to determine whether something occurs. If there's a random possibility of something happen, that's what your d10s are for in that game. And so if there's a 20% chance of something that happens, I want to roll that number or less than. If I roll 2 d10s and one comes up 7 and the other one comes 8, that's 78%. It didn't happen. If I roll 2 d10s and it comes up a 1 and a 5, that's 20% or under. It did happen. That's the basic crux of how that works. Now there's another way to handle that type of system, which is the Shadowrun and Vampire the Masquerade system, where each stat and each skill is assigned a number value, and that equals a number of dice that you roll for that particular skill. And then certain numbers are given successes. In this case, it's, if you're looking at Shadowrun, it's 5s and 6s. All 5s and 6s are successes. Anything under that is not a success. So if I have a 4 in agility and a 4 in pistols, I will roll 8 dice, and I'm looking for a number of successes in that dice, which is usually countered by a reaction roll by the enemy. They have a slight chance of dodging the fire. And Vampire the Masquerade works very similarly. You usually have a stat that's 1 to 5 and a corresponding skill that is 1 to 5, and that's how many d10s that you roll in order to make your successes. Now, Vampire the Masquerade, we finally come to it after 20 minutes of meandering and heartfelt dialogue. I swear to God, I barely took a break during any of that. That was all preamble. I didn't mean for it to all be preamble, but it all was important. Like, what we have been talking about these last 3 sessions is role-playing games, and not necessarily, I talked about the games themselves that I liked. I talked about the things that I did in those games, but I didn't necessarily talk about the structure of those games or why I enjoyed them or why I thought that they were, important. Or even, something that you should spend your time doing. And I feel like the last 20 minutes that we've been talking, I've covered those bases. How they work, kind of brief little touch on those, and why I think they're fun, and why I think they're a valid outlet. A valid way to spend your time. I think I covered all of that. I'd always been familiar with the concept of role-playing games because of my brother. He introduced me to them. He did a neat little thing where when I was a young lad. I just wanted to know what they were like. And we didn't have any books or any character sheets or anything. So he just made up something really simple on the spot. He had me jot down some stuff on a paper, and we had a D10. That's all we had. We didn't have any other dice. And he just ran me through this really cheap scenario that I'm sure somebody else had done a much more thorough job of exploring. But it was amazing. It transported me from where I was, and I was in a whole nother world, and I actually got to make decisions in that world, and the decisions that I made affected what happened. And that was a big moment for me. I was very, very, very young. Can't remember when it happened. I recreated this instance with a couple of my cousins. basically did exactly the same thing that he did. We didn't have a D10, only had D6s, but we made it work. And basically, you have a simple world. You have a world that you create, and you have characters in that world, and they're given personalities, and you have a rule. You have a die roll that determines something. And I mean, at the basic rudimentary level of it is, like, if you want to get as simple as you can get, you have 1d6, and you have a fail, 1 to 2, you have a success, 5 to 6, and then if you're doing a skill, then you could have a almost 3 to 4. So if I'm trying to pick a lock, if I roll 1 to 2, I fail, lock breaks. If I roll 5 to 6, success. If I roll 3 to 4, that's an almost, right? So I can try again, and now it's 50-50. 1 to 3, lock breaks, can't get through. 4 to 6, we get all the way, lock opens, move on. Obviously, when it's combat, things are a little more hairier, so usually you go with the higher numbers. 5 to 6, that's your success rate. But you can see how you can start with something like that. And if you're a mathematical genius, like the dudes that make these games, you can make it infinitely more complicated and way more interesting. But that's like a basic stepping stone. So when I was in high school, I was finally ready to get in my own role-playing games. And I wasn't sure where to start. I mean, D&D was what everyone was doing, but I didn't know that was necessarily for me. I wasn't the biggest fantasy fan in the world back then. One thing I was super into was Interview with a Vampire. Like, that was one of my favorite movies when I was that young. And I was also a big fan of The Crow. So goth culture from the 90s and Anne Rice vampires, like, that was two things that I was really heavily into. And then my girlfriend in high school introduced me to the John Leakley created, Aaron Spelling executive produced TV show called Kindred the Embraced, which was terrible. Couldn't even pretend to feign interest in it. It's not good. But it was based on a role-playing series created by genius game creator Mark Reinhagen of Vampire the Masquerade. And in this world, vampires are divided into a series of bloodlines called clans. And this justifies the various different types of vampires that are seen throughout the ages and in TV and movies. You've got there's the basic 7 clans with the TV show focused on, in which the first book, the second edition Vampire the Masquerade book, which is where I started things, focused on. Alright, so there is the Masquerade, alright, is basically a law, or a kind of a governing principle that's put down among vampires who are of the sect known as the Camarilla, or Camarilla, depending on what part of the world you come from. And the Masquerade's governing principles are basically hiding in plain sight. That if humanity is made aware a vampire's presence in their world, then they outnumber us by large numbers. They rise up against us and they can destroy us. So anonymity is important. To be unknown, to live in a world of darkness and in shadows is our primary goal. Do not let the humans know about us. Do not let the humans remember us. In very extreme circumstances, destroy humans who learn of our existence. Now, vampires have magical powers in this world that can wipe men's minds and can fog men's minds and can change the way that they remember things or make them not remember things at all. The Embrace from Kindred the Embraced, and also used in the Vampire the Masquerade. The Embrace is what vampires call it when a human is made into a vampire, very similar to the Anne Rice rules, where you drain most of the human's blood and you replace some of their blood with a vampire's blood, usually by means of slicing a wrist and feeding that down the human's throat. It's magic, so it doesn't really matter that the blood doesn't enter their system for a series of hours until it's digested. That's not what. The blood enters their body through their mouth and they become vampires. There's no need to bury them in the ground. They just become vampires. Though you can, if you're a dick, and there is a sect called the Sabbat, which tend to do this. So basically to erase all traces of their humanity, they will embrace someone, make them a vampire, and bury them in the ground so that they have to claw their way out. And they don't, vampires don't breathe, so they don't suffocate, they just stay down there until they're ready to find their way out. So there's infinite number of complicated rules. Nearly have enough time to get into. Oh my god. All of this was preamble? Jesus, I might have to make this a 4-parter. I really might. Like, I haven't even begun to talk about the clans. The 7 clans that make up the Camarilla. The 3 clans that make up the Sabbat. And the 3 independent clans that work to destroy all of it. Oh my god. I can't believe it. This is going to be a quadrilogy. That's what it's going to be. We're going to have to stop right now because what I'm about to talk about is going to take 25 minutes minimum, if not that. And I think everything that I've got up to this point was actually important. And I think that even if I didn't, I laid a pretty firm groundwork for what's going to come after this. Because Vampire the Masquerade gets pretty dark. It's not your typical RPG where, oh, I want to fight a dragon, and oh, I'm an elf, and I can cast pretty spells. And no, this shit helped me explore some of the darker parts of my personality. And actually, eventually made me feel better about myself. Let me figure out that I wasn't necessarily the weirdest motherfucker on the planet. Sometimes I felt that way. And also that, there's 1,000 different ways to look at the world. There's 1,000 different lenses that we can view it through. And yeah, you can see the world as this dark and dreary place. And only wonder about what lies in the shadows. And you can become one of those shadows and become one of those horrible things. Or you can just take a vacation in the dark side of your mind, get out by 6, punch out, go home, take a shower, and get back to regular life after that. It'll make more sense when I talk about the game, which again, I have spent this session talking about things that lead up to it, and I apologize for that. I would make this an hour, but I know no one's going to fucking listen to it. So, we'll keep it at 30 minutes, and I swear that the next time I talk about this will be the last time I will talk about role-playing games for at least a couple weeks. I'll get into other things after that. There's still the review of a movie that I'm going to do with my brother. Still talking about that. Still going to make that happen. We're not going to do... I think I might have mentioned this last week. We're not going to do The Shape of Water anymore. But there's another movie I have in mind, which I think everyone should have seen if they haven't already, and we'll get into it. But I'll talk about that next time. I don't want you to blow your wad on that one too early. I want that one to simmer. I want you to watch it and then we talk about it. That's how I want that to happen. So that's hopefully next time. I will finish up with my role-playing game quadrilogy, Vampire the Masquerade. We're going to talk about that next time in depth. No provisos, no quid pro quos. We'll just get right down to it, and then we'll move on. Until the next time I talk about this, but I swear there'll be some break in between that. So as always, I love you guys, and you guys take care of each other, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you for coming to I Bought a Microphone.